All right, welcome back. I'm going to go over the findings and the conclusion in part 2 of this video overview. So let me share my screen. All right, sharing and recording. Good to go. All right, so findings. We've gone over the intro, the lit review, and the methodology. What are the findings in chapter 4? Well, there are 4 different sample pools. I guess 3. There's the UK, and then I test the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and then I test the Nikkei 225. Part 1 has 2 parts, so UK before and after IFRS adoption in 2005, and then the UK firms that use IFRS compared to all the UK firms that don't use IFRS, with the US thrown in as a control group. I won't go into detail of these first 2 steps. This was initial testing, and it found, and there are 2 important conclusions. One is what I found. I found somewhat ambiguous results with the Beaver methodology, which could be explained, but it would have just complicated the presentation on Defense Day. For the Ball and Brown methodology, I found evidence of IFRS superiority. So the UK market leaned towards IFRS superiority, but there was the issue of the ambiguous results with the Beaver methodology. There was another interesting thing that I found in the UK markets, and that was a surprising strength of the analyst-based qualitative variable for measuring earnings. So recall there's 6 different ways that earnings would be measured. It can either be a naive variable, a drift-adjusted variable, or an analyst-adjusted variable, and each of them can be either magnitude or qualitative. So that would be a total of 6 different ways, and the one that produced the strongest correlations consistently was the analyst-adjusted qualitative variable. And it was not only the strongest, but it was the only one that really even seemed like a reasonable correlation metric of 0.3 or 0.4. And I didn't have access to that metric as much as I would have liked for information before IFRS adoption in UK, because Bloomberg just didn't track as rigorously in that market before 2005. So I was missing some of the data if I was going to use the strongest correlation metric. So for those 2 reasons: one, that there were some ambiguous results that I would have to explain, and 2, because I wasn't going to be able to use this variable that I found to be very strong, I moved on from the UK market. The next step was looking at the Tokyo Stock Exchange and trying to measure as many firms as possible in 2018. The top close to 2,000 firms, or the biggest by share price 2,000 firms. Those results indicated a similar story as the UK results. The Beaver metrics showed ambiguous results, which could have been explained, but there would be some challenges there. The Ball and Brown results showed IFRS superiority. So I could have made the case for IFRS superiority, but there was some cloudy gray area in the Beaver results. The other thing that was the same as the UK test was the consistently strong performance of that analyst-adjusted qualitative variable. So it was surprising, again, that this qualitative variable performed so strongly. The analyst-adjusted variable was expected to perform strongly, but the qualitative variable was a surprise. So I wanted to continue my research by finding less ambiguous results that pointed one direction or the other. And I determined that one reason I may be getting ambiguous results in the Tokyo Stock Exchange is because of the variety of firms that I was using, from extremely large firms to extremely small firms. I felt that the Nikkei 225 would be a way to control that comparison, because there were very specific requirements for being on the Nikkei 225. Firm size, shares outstanding, and a couple of other things that would allow for consistency. So if I had a group of firms on the Nikkei 225 that chose IFRS and a group of firms that chose Japanese GAAP, I would at least be assured that they had a number of characteristics in common. So the Nikkei 225 is where I found those consistent control groups, and I found clear results, and that is where this dissertation is resting on. Those are the conclusions that are the basis of this dissertation. So I will go into more details on the results of the Nikkei 225, and as I go through each of these results, I'll just explain the conclusion right there as we look at the table, and then that will just leave us with some overall conclusions at the end. So testing the Nikkei 225. As I mentioned, there are some characteristics that all Nikkei 225 firms have in common, but my one concern was that there would be a different industry representation in the firms that choose IFRS versus the firms that choose Japanese GAAP. So it wasn't one of the first things I did, but one of the first things I accent or explain in this dissertation is the comparability test, proportion difference test of industry representation. So let's take a look, page 260, table 20. So here I have the IFRS sample so I have the different industries, GISC sectors, and I have the IFRS percentage of those firms. And I compare that to the full Nikkei sample, because the Nikkei sample is known to be representative of the Japanese economy. So if I have a sample that's representative of the Nikkei, then I can make broader statements about the Japanese economy. I can also say that I have a fair representation in my IFRS sample. So here's the IFRS percentage, here's the Nikkei percentage, proportion difference, z-scores, p-values. Low p-value is going to indicate a statistically significant proportion difference. There is only one industry that has that proportion difference, healthcare, 3.6% p-value. So if you look at the details, Nikkei, full Nikkei sample 4.5%, IFRS sample 16.1%. So there may be an overrepresentation of healthcare firms. So that's going to be a caveat in the conclusion. We say, all right, there may be an overrepresentation of healthcare firms. Besides that, there does not seem to be a systematic difference between the firms that chose IFRS and the full Nikkei sample. So I also did a chi-square goodness of fit test, which says there is a difference. The question is what that difference is, and is it systematic? So we go back to the proportion difference test, and we have those results. All right, so that provides the basis for a fair comparison if we're looking at Beaver mean comparison metrics. So let's look at the Beaver trading volume mean difference. All right, so table 22 on page 262. All right, top line, we've got IFRS firms. Bottom line, we've got Japanese GAAP firms. Sample sizes, close to 300 IFRS firms, above 2,000 Japanese GAAP firms. What is the mean trading volume ratio? Remember, higher indicates more valuable information content. So the mean ratio for IFRS firms is 1.49. Mean ratio for Japanese GAAP firms, 1.21. IFRS firms are higher. Difference of 0.28. Is it statistically significant? Yes, at the 1% level. Indication of higher information content for IFRS firms. Does the median support these results? Median is not as statistically rigorous, but it does support these results. I also looked at skew. So if we looked at the skew statistics, IFRS firms, the skew in that sample is 3.05. The skew in the Japanese GAAP is 6.21. So the Japanese GAAP is more positively skewed. So we have a group of outlier or a group of outliers in the extreme upper tail that are pulling the mean higher that may not be representative of the typical firm. Does that pose a problem for us? Turns out, no, it does not, because even though there are a few atypical firms in the Japanese gap, for example, that are pulling the mean higher, that still doesn't give us a higher mean comparison to the IFRS firm. So we still have a statistically lower trading volume for Japanese gap. Okay, so that's our Beaver mean comparison. Let's look at the Beaver regression statistics. So we're going to look at two things. One is just the simple regression analysis. So we have the we have the trading volume ratio as the dependent variable. And we have the IFRS, yes, no, quality is the firm IFRS or not, qualitative variable as the independent variable. Is that variable statistically significant? Yes, it is. Is it positive? Yes, it is. So if a firm adopts IFRS, we would expect a statistically higher trading volume ratio. That supports the mean, confirms the mean comparison test. All right, the probably more rigorous regression comparison is going to be the multiple regression. So let's go to that multiple regression analysis. All right, here we have same dependent variable, the trading volume ratio, abnormal trading volume or event period trading volume divided by average trading volume. What's the ratio? And we have a whole slew of independent variables. The IFRS qualitative variable is 1. We're going to take note of whether or not that is statistically significant. And also we've included all of these control variables that have been identified as possible confounding variables in other literature. So we have controlled for market capitalization, number of analysts, analyst agreement, lag, financial leverage, a slew of income metrics. Just the fact that we include these variables as control variables adds rigor and allows us to look more carefully and put more faith in the outcome of the gap, of the IFRS qualitative independent variable. We can discuss which of these control variables are statistically significant, and I do in each of the sections, but there are no overall conclusions with that because I don't find anything dissertation worthy in terms of an overall conclusion of the control variables. All right, so with all these control variables considered, let's take a look at the p-value for the IFRS qualitative variable. All right, so it is positive, indicating a greater trading volume for IFRS. Is it statistically significant? All right, it's 9.7%. It's debatable. We would prefer 1%. Second choice would be 5%, 10%. If it fits in with a mosaic of evidence, we could potentially use this as support. And the argument in this dissertation is going to be that it does fit in with a whole mosaic of evidence, that the effect of IFRS has been demonstrated in the literature and all the other supporting tests, and the 10% significance level can be added as additional support to show IFRS superiority. All right, so Beaver mean regression. So let's look at the Ball and Brown tests. Okay, so now remember the Ball and Brown they compare earnings or compare surprise earnings with abnormal returns. And we're going to say the ones that have the highest correlation, if the IFRS firms has a higher correlation than the Japanese gap firms, then we're going to say that IFRS has superior value relevance, stronger correlation. Therefore, the IFRS accounting statements better represent the characteristics, the reality of the performance of those firms that use that standard. But the question is, a key question is which method do we use to measure surprise earnings? Okay, so do we use just a naive measure of earnings? Well, we already said in the literature, no, we're not going to just use a naive measure of earnings. Do we use the most specific expectation possible based on analyst expectations? Yes, that's the metric that we use, the most specific expectation possible based on analyst expectations. And then in the middle of that, there's going to be the drift adjusted variables. In addition to that, if we're using naive, analyst, drift adjusted, we can either use a magnitude, like 1%, 2%, negative 4%, whatever the magnitude of surprise is, or we can use a qualitative variable. Is the surprise better or worse than expected? The literature says magnitude variables are probably going to perform better. But remember, in these earlier steps here, the UK, both steps in the Tokyo Stock Exchange, we found that qualitative variables are performing better. So I do ranking tests. We already did a ranking test based on the literature, and we got exactly what I just said. Also, I do a ranking test based on the actual results. Which of these metrics better defines, better correlates with abnormal returns? What do I have here? So I have the ranking test here. Do I rank them? Yes, table 27 on page 267 ranks them. The finding that would be surprising if we just considered the literature is that the qualitative variables all rank very highly. The percentage, which is magnitude is the percentage, all rank low. So this is this measure of surprise earnings, the ability of that measure to correlate with actual price. Qualitative variables rank very high, magnitude variables rank lower. So this is based on the empirical results of all phases of, this particular outcome is just based on the IFRS sample in Japan. But in addition to that, we have the previous tests that support the use of a qualitative variable. And that's going to be important because I'm going to make the argument that we can look at the qualitative variable and say that a stronger qualitative variable is going to suggest superiority, and we're going to base our decision on that. So let's do that. Let's look at page table 28. Or no, this is, I'm sorry, 20. These next tables are just the same type of ranking test using a chi-square test for independence rather than a regression analysis. 28, 29, and table 30 do that. So it's table 31 on page 269. Let me give us some more room here. Is going to be the Ball and Brown outcomes, the correlation metrics. Okay, so here we have, top line, we have our IFRS firms, correlation metrics. The bottom section, we have Japanese GAAP firms, correlation metrics. So we have correlation, R squared, the significance, the p-value, sample size for each accounting standard. In the various rows, we have our method of measuring earnings. Do we use naive magnitude, naive qualitative, drift adjusted magnitude, drift adjusted qualitative, analyst surprise magnitude, or analyst surprise qualitative? All right, so let's take a look. Well, the top line, I see stronger correlation here for IFRS compared to Japanese GAAP for the analyst adjusted qualitative. I see a number that's higher here for the analyst magnitude versus the Japanese GAAP magnitude, although this Japanese GAAP has stronger statistical significance, p-value of 0%. This has a p-value of 9%. So we're going to need to think about whether or not we can take that as an acceptable statistically significant outcome. Drift adjusted here, I see just a qualitative, I see superior performance for the IFRS sample compared to the Japanese GAAP sample. Drift adjusted magnitude, I see lower performance for the IFRS and higher performance for Japanese GAAP. So for the naive variables, I see lower performance for IFRS, higher performance for Japanese GAAP for both of them. All right, so the argument that I'm going to make in this dissertation is that these three variables are the ones that we can base our conclusion on, because the analyst-based variables are expected to be the strongest because of the literature, and that is demonstrated in all the previous steps, that the analyst variables are the strongest. Furthermore, the qualitative variables are empirically demonstrated to be the strongest in each of these research steps. It is a bit of a surprise, but it is consistent in all of these empirical steps. So I'm going to make the argument that the analyst surprise variable based on the qualitative variable is the variable that we should put the most stock in, most faith in for making our conclusion. Analyst surprise based on magnitude is consistent with the literature. And if we are able to relax our significance level to 10%, as I think we are because it's part of a mosaic of evidence, then the analyst surprise variable, the analyst magnitude variable also supports our conclusion of IFRS superiority. Drift adjusted qualitative variable, drift adjusted is expected to form middle ground, and the qualitative variable should be given more weight based on the empirical consistency of that variable. And so these three variables that we would expect to be the strongest, the most indicative of the true value, indicate IFRS superiority. All right, now how about how about the other three? Well, these other three do lean towards Japanese GAAP superiority. So, but the naive variables we can easily dismiss because no one in the literature ever, well, not no one, Ball and Brown never expected naive variables to perform well. A couple of the studies right after Ball and Brown said, oh, look, naive variables perform well, but those were just seemed to be one-off. It just so happened that they performed well. There's no real literature support for naive variables, so we can dismiss both of these pretty easily. The reason why I'm going to make the argument that we can dismiss the drift-adjusted magnitude variable is because the drift-adjusted is not expected to be the strongest based on the literature. The more specific analyst-adjusted variables are expected to be stronger. And the magnitude variables have just not performed well in these steps. And that's not just the Nikkei sample that I'm basing my results on. It has not performed well in the Tokyo Stock Exchange example and the UK samples in a completely different time period. So with that, I'm going to suggest IFRS superiority. Now it turns out to just be a suggestion. So these metrics, these three metrics for IFRS are higher than these three metrics for Japanese GAAP. I do attempt to add statistical rigor by doing the aforementioned bootstrapping method. So I develop a confidence interval for all of these metrics based on bootstrapping, a process of resampling. What happens there? Well, it turns out that they do not withstand the statistical test of bootstrapping. So we are left with just suggesting and not statistically proving superiority. But again, if it's going to be part of a whole mosaic of evidence, I feel we have a strong argument. So let's look at the results of the bootstrapping. All right, so if we look at just this one, remember we said the analyst adjusted qualitative variable for IFRS was 0.03 and for Japanese GAAP was 0.248. IFRS is stronger, so it suggests that IFRS has stronger value relevance. But what if we develop a confidence interval based on a bootstrapping methodology? What if we do an 80% lower and upper confidence interval? So 80% is going to give us a tighter confidence interval than a 90%, but it turns out we don't even need to go to 90% because the 80% doesn't even show us statistically significant results. So the actual result is 0.3 based on this bootstrapping procedure. It could be as low as 0.235 or as high as 0.37. If we consider that IFRS sample to be a sample, or if we consider it to be part of a larger population, or if we say, if this goes on for another 10 years, what would the results be? They wouldn't be the 0.35. They could change based on these random fluctuations. So we are left then with just the suggestion based on the data so far, which is all the data for all the Nikkei 225 firms that are using IFRS. We have it all, but just based on that so far, we can't add that statistical rigor. So we have to look at that whole mosaic of evidence, and we have to propose some sort of argument that I just went through. Why do we think why do we think we should base our decision on the analyst adjusted variables, and why should we use the qualitative variables, and how do those three support our conclusion? How does that fit in with the Beaver results, which also support that conclusion? And how does that fit in with the overall IFRS literature, which also support a conclusion of superiority? So that's the argument. All right. And so these results, I just go into detail for each of these income metrics, trying to analyze and figuring out if it's appropriate to make that case. All right, so what does that leave us then with overall conclusions? So I'm going to go to the conclusion section, which is where I discuss all these conclusions that I've just discussed, except in this video, I gave them to you when I presented results and when I presented conclusions at the exact same time. What are the overall conclusions? 1, stronger information content in IFRS in Japan. So this is the first known empirical test of comparing different accounting standards in Japan, and the only developed market where we can make a fair comparison. We have found results that suggest IFRS superiority. This could be very relevant to future research, and I will discuss it in my future research, including continued study in Japan, continued study as Japan considers different companies consider voluntarily adopting. So other companies could say, we're going to voluntarily adopt IFRS 2. Japan may continue discussing mandatory adoption. That discussion has been paused for now, but that may be an additional consideration. What is the other conclusion, the other valuable takeaway from this dissertation? It's that strength of qualitative variables over magnitude variables. So this was not expected. The only reason we used qualitative variables in this dissertation was because they were used in the original Ball and Brown study. They were not used in really any of the contemporary literature. Now, I actually don't think I discussed this in this overview video, but given that I had this result, there is a good section in the literature review discussing why qualitative variables might be strong in measuring surprise income. There's 2 reasons. One is there are a number of studies that show a nonlinear relationship between earnings and price. So if the relationship between earnings and price, so earnings, income, and stock performance, if that is not linear, then we might expect something other than a linear regression, a linear relationship to provide the most information. It could be a nonlinear model, as some of those studies found, or it could be a qualitative variable, as we have found in this study. The second reason why qualitative variables might be expected to perform well is the fact that there's always been this known weak relationship between earnings and price. So no one has ever said that company earnings, net income, is going to fully explain variations and fluctuations in price. Before 1968, people said they don't have anything to do with one another. After 1968, the scholars said, okay, yes, there is a relationship between earnings and price, but no one has ever said it's a strong relationship. It's been correlation metrics of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, percentage of variation explained of 5%, 14%, that type of area. So given that there has not ever been any assertions of a strong relationship, it could be that the more general qualitative classification is a better way to measure or categorize surprise income. That could be related to my use of Bloomberg, which has been known for providing strong analyst estimates, and it is used somewhat in dissertation research and scholarly research, but not used a great deal of amount. So that is an interesting finding, and it could be related to the use of Bloomberg. Our overall conclusions. Now, what are the limitations? All right, the key limitation is the voluntary adoption bias. So these firms, which I state show stronger information content, they voluntarily adopted IFRS. So they may have said, and you can make the argument, we are going to choose IFRS because we think IFRS is going to be better for us. So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be better for every firm. Two arguments I make about that. One, it's important to have that result. I mean, even though it contains some bias, that's what's happening in the Japanese accounting environment. We have a bunch of firms that have voluntarily chosen IFRS, so we need empirical results for what the outcome has been. And we have them in this dissertation. We have results that say the information content is better for the IFRS firms in Japan compared to the Japanese GAAP firms in Japan. So it's important just to have the results of the reality of what has actually happened. As more information comes in, more firms start adopting, we can expand, we or other researchers can expand that analysis. The other point I make in this write-up is that that is potentially a good thing in and of itself. Regardless of the fact of whether or not it's a completely fair comparison, just the fact that we have an option that Japanese companies can use that gives them better value of information content is a good thing. So if I'm a company and I can choose an accounting standard that more accurately represents the reality of my economic situation, then that is a positive occurrence in the accounting environment in Japan. Now, how could we get over this? All right, so I just mentioned it's a good thing if a company can say, oh, look, now I have stronger, better value of information content compared to the companies that aren't using this standard. Does that mean that every company should mandatorily be required to switch to IFRS? Well, it doesn't, just based on that. But what if we did a before and after comparison? All right, so this is going to be both a limitation I mentioned in this study, and it's also going to be something I mentioned as future research, as continued research. We could do this before and after comparison. We could say the companies that chose IFRS, let's look at what their information content was before they made the switch to IFRS. And if we can say that it improved in each and every case or consistently, then we are in a better position to make the suggestion that all companies should be mandatorily required to use IFRS because most companies improve. We still have a voluntary adoption bias, but that before and after comparison, the direct before and after comparison would strengthen this, this analysis. This would be difficult to do, and I discuss a couple reasons why it'd be difficult to do. One is the time period. Japanese firms adopted IFRS over a 10-year time period, and it was slowly, so we need to go back at least 10 years plus a few years before that to make a fair before and after comparison. The other complicating factor is that some of these companies that switched from US GAAP to IFRS. Other companies switched from Japanese GAAP to IFRS. So they're coming from two different areas. So doing a before and after comparison would be very tricky, but it is something that could potentially strengthen the results in this dissertation and could be used to make a case for potential mandatory adoption in IFRS. Okay, so all those things could be studied in future research, continued research in Japan. We could also look at the strength of qualitative variables over magnitude variables, which is a potential contribution of this dissertation. Last thing we could potentially look at in future research is US GAAP in Japan. There were companies that used US GAAP this whole analysis period in my study, but the samples were small. I did the analysis on them and I included them with my my IFRS and Japanese GAAP comparisons. I ultimately decided to take them out, one, because the small sample size did not allow for fair comparisons, also because I didn't want to tease anyone because those small sample sizes often had stunningly high performance measures. So it looked like the US gap just was knocking it out of the park compared to the other two. But I didn't want to corrupt my results that way. But those small sample sizes did show some promise of the strength of US gap, which could be a need for future testing. Okay, so that is the overview. I'm getting my second wind here. I'm excited about this. Excited to continue working with you all over the next 3+ weeks to hear any suggestions, any changes, any additional rigor that needs to be either presented in the way I explain things, or needs to be added, adjusted in the dissertation. So thank you all. Look forward to being in touch. So I'm going to stop share and I'm going to stop the recording.